You can probably tell we have good communication in our household, and Kathy said, "What's the reading for today?" And somehow it got mixed up. Never mind, it's fine. Now, the book of Job, I thought, what a topic. And when I began to think about this topic, I was really unsure, and where do you start? I'm being a little bit unsure of where to begin. An old piece of Irish humour and wit floated into my mind, and it goes like this. A tourist in Ireland was lost, and arriving at a remote Irish village, he asked a local, "How do you get to Dublin from here?" And the response went something like this. "Well, let me see. If I was wanting to go to Dublin, I wouldn't want to be starting from here." Now, this helped me arrive at the obvious answer as to where to begin. And that is, if you want to talk about Job, you begin at the beginning. So this morning's message sensibly begins at chapter 1, verse 1. And in the context of this little piece of Irish wisdom, that's a better place to start if you want to go to Dublin. The message has 4 parts. The first part puts the story of Job into its time and place, or where and when did it happen. And part 2 is a brief summary of what the lessons in Job are. Other words, why the book of Job. Part 3 is the unfolding story of Job from chapters 1 through to chapter 42. In other words, what happens in Job? And part 4 brings it into relevance for us today. It's what is God's wisdom in allowing to happen what did happen. In other words, what does the story of Job mean for us? So let's look at Job in time and place, or where and when. Now, last week we heard the story of Joseph and his tale of being sold into captivity in Egypt, and how God used this for the good of many. Now, my Bible has a timeline of biblical events and dates Joseph's sale into slavery in Egypt at 1898 BC. And a second biblical timeline I studied places the story of Job at approximately 1900 BC. So the story of Joseph and the unfolding story of Job are roughly happening at about the same time, but in different locations. And the story of Job occurs in the land of Uz. Job chapter 1. In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the peoples of the East. Now, from this we learn that the setting of the story is the land of Uz, and that's a fertile land somewhere east of the Jordan River, and possibly in modern-day southeast Jordan or the western portions of Saudi Arabia. And the story is also an old story, and we learn this from the source of Job's wealth, which is in his extensive herds of sheep, camels, oxen, donkeys, and a large number of servants. And 2 other matters to consider here also is, given that the approximate dating of Job to 1900 BC, the story is set outside the lands of what became the nation of Israel after Joshua's entry into the promised land. And the story is set at approximately the very stirrings of Israel's journey to become a nation, with these stirrings beginning about the time that Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt. So this leads us to the relevance of Job, or why. Now, given that the location of Job is in Uz, which is outside the territory of a future biblical Israeli or Jewish nation of Israel, and occurs before Israel was founded, means that the story is not occurring in a Jewish nation. The participants in this story are not Jewish, so it's not a Jewish story. But it's a story for all of us. It's relevant to all people from all time and places who believe in God and who have faith in God, and beyond that to non-believers as well, because the story talks about evil, suffering and its consequences, and the need for trust and faith in God. We've also heard that the story of Job occurs somewhere around 1900 BC, but it wasn't committed to writing until sometime around about 1000 BC, or maybe date going forward to about 750 BC, and it was possibly written by Solomon, but that's not a certainty. Now, in parallel to the story of Job, there's a very similar Babylonian record, also from around about 1000 BC, and this is called the Babylonian Theodicy. This is written on clay tablets in a language called Akkadian and telling essentially the same story. And so what is a theodicy? A theodicy is an explanation of why a perfectly good, almighty and all-knowing God permits evil. And what do we have in Job? God permitting evil. And the obvious questions to ask are then, why does God permit evil? Why does God permit suffering? And why doesn't God do something about it? And this morning's reading provides an answer. It's not necessarily an easy answer either. And the reading shows Job finally realising that God is all-powerful and human understanding of him and his ways is at the best limited. When Job says to God, and I'll just repeat this morning's reading, I know that you can do all things, no purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now and I will speak. I will question you and you shall answer me. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. And Job in these verses has come to the understanding that God isn't merely a more advanced version of us. He is something completely other than us, and within the limits of human understanding, it's difficult to grasp the mind of the one who created the universe and rules over it with absolute power. God is God, and we're not. And in absolute faith, we need to remember this. So let's move on to the story of Job, or what happens. As I've already said, a good place to start with the story of Job is in Job chapter 1. We've already read about his wealth, that he's a God-fearing righteous man and has a large family of 10 adult children. God then allows Satan to test Job's faithfulness to God. Satan tells God that the only reason Job is faithful is because of his wealth and comfortable lifestyle, and so it's easy to be faithful. But by the end of chapter 1, Job has had all his herds stolen, and his servants and children are all dead. But Job remains faithful to God. Satan then approaches God again, and in chapter 2, God allows Satan to harm Job's body. And so Job ends up with painful sores all over his body. There's a short conversation recorded between Job and his wife about being faithful in Job chapter 2, verse 9, which reads, his wife said to him, Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. He replied, You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" So Job remains faithful to God. Three times in chapter 1 and 2, we read that Job is blameless and upright, or in other translations, righteous. God himself says this twice, but this should not be taken as saying that Job is sinless. God is saying that Job is not suffering because of his sin, but God permits suffering and evil, and why doesn't he... Sorry, I missed a bit here. So God's not saying that Job is sinless. God is saying that Job is not suffering because of his sin. Sin isn't why Job is suffering. And in chapters 3 through to 37, we have the unfolding story of Job and 4 of his friends discussing the thorny problems of why does God permit suffering and evil, and why doesn't he do something about it. And 3 of his friends attempt to comfort Job, if comfort is using the right word. And they tell Job that he's suffering because of his sin and he's made God angry. They argue a seemingly very common sense line that a just and fair God will treat people fairly. So if you obey God and remain faithful, you will be rewarded. If you sin, you will be rewarded. And if you sin, you will be punished. To them, the situation is crystal clear. They know that God is just. Therefore, because Job is suffering, Job cannot possibly be just. And therefore, he's done something wrong and he's not confessed his sin to God. And Job strongly denies this. But with the constant arguments from his friends that he must have sinned, Job begins to waver, although he knows deep down he must be innocent of any wrongdoing. And Job finally breaks and begins to curse God and becomes increasingly angry with him for allowing Job, a blameless and upright man, to suffer like he has suffered. And here are some examples. Job 16 verse 9. God assails me and tears me in his anger and gnashes his teeth at me. Job 19 verse 7. Though I cry, I've been wronged, I get no response. Though I call for help, there's no justice. And some excerpts from Job chapter 30. In his great power, God throws me into the mud. I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand you attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. Surely no one lays a hand on a broken man when he cries for help in his distress. Have I not wept for those in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? Yet when I hoped for good, evil came, and when I looked for light, then came darkness. Now this is a very human reaction to trouble, as people do blame God when things go wrong, or their lives become seemingly impossible. Even when they don't believe, the non-believers turn and blame God. There's no denying that Job here is accusing God of being distant, cruel, and perhaps a bit of a bully. Job was upset that God wasn't answering him. At no stage, though, does Job turn his back on God. He may be upset with God's justice, but he doesn't give up on God. And then the 4th and younger friend, called Elihu, speaks up. And here is where we can see the first glimmer of hope for Job appear. Although sometimes it's a bit like seeing the light at the end of a tunnel, and you hope it is the light at the end of the tunnel, and maybe it's just that train approaching from the opposite direction. But the 4th and younger friend speaks up, and it is here that we can see that first glimmer of hope for Job appearing. In short, Elihu condemns Job's friends for stating that Job's sin was the cause of his suffering. Elihu then condemns Job's claim of being without sin. Elihu reminds Job that the upright and blameless do suffer, and then declares that suffering does fit in with God's justice. And further, Elihu condemns Job's attitude towards God, where at times he thought of God as his enemy. Elihu exalts God's greatness, and Elihu speaks up because he is. He's very angry with Job for justifying Job rather than justifying God. And he's also very angry with Job's three friends because they had found no way to show that Job was wrong, yet they had condemned him. And Elihu's words offer insights for us today. Firstly, but God brings Job to an understanding that believers don't always know what God is doing in their lives. We saw this in the story of Joseph, with Joseph saying to his brothers, "Don't be afraid, am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And Joseph is here saying that only God knew that good would come from Joseph's suffering. And this is in effect part of a message for us in Job. And secondly, Elihu emphasised God and his greatness rather than focus on a human response to problems. And thirdly, he responded with respect, allowing the others to speak first before offering his own response. These traits can help us today as we seek to understand why God allows suffering and as we attempt to help others who face suffering. Now, when we are aware of a friend who is hurting, we can follow the positive example of Job's friends by going to that person and mourning with them and spending time together. Being there with a hurting friend can be of great comfort, even if we have no words to say. But at the same time, we also see that Job's friends were wrong. We should not assume that the troubles are necessarily the sign of God's judgment. For example, let's see in John chapter 9, verses 1 to 3, where Jesus says, "As he went along, he," that is Jesus, "saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?' 'Neither this man nor his parents sinned,' said Jesus, 'but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him.'" Instead of telling a hurting person to admit their wrongs and repent when we do not know the reasons for the suffering, we can encourage a friend to endure faithfully, knowing that God sees our pain and has a purpose for it. If we enter into the pain of a suffering friend, we follow the example of Jesus, who came to bear our pain and suffer in our place. Our help to those in need is ultimately a way we serve Christ, as in Matthew chapter 25, verses 34 to 36 and 40, where Jesus says, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." And so we come to chapters 38 to 42. Here God answers Job, but not by answering the question directly of why God allowed Job to suffer. Instead, God tells Job that God is God and Job is not God, and that Job could never understand God's way or his reasons for doing things. These are really amazing chapters where we hear directly from God. And God asks Job some questions like, Job chapter 38 verse 4, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you possess understanding. Who sets its measurements, if you know?" Job 38, 12 and 13. "Have you ever in your life commanded the morning or made the dawn know its place, that it might seize the corners of the earth and shake the wicked out of it?" Or Job chapter 40, verses 6 through to 10. "Then the Lord spoke to Job out of a storm. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's? And can your voice thunder like his? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendour and clothe yourself in honour and majesty." And what Job needed to learn is what we need to learn, that when God's ways don't make sense to us, we need to trust his wisdom. And finally we see Job's wealth being restored to him, and so are his family and friends. Now that he's restored to a comfortable and wealthy life, his friends give him the sympathy and comfort that he needed when he was destitute. The book of Job tells us to be different to this. It encourages us not to assume that a suffering person has brought it upon themselves. So, what is the relevance of Job, and what does it mean for us? In the conclusion, I've just come to 3 points. And the first point is that Job questions our faith. Do we serve God because of the benefits it brings? Do we serve out of self-interest? And do we give because we hope we're going to be blessed? Or do we serve because we acknowledge that God is something completely other than us, and we must place absolute trust in him as the one who created the universe and rules over it with absolute power? God is God and we are not. In absolute faith, we need to remember this. I'm reading from Isaiah chapters 55 verses 8 to 9, where it says exactly this. God says, well, just reading the verses, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And point 2, God doesn't directly answer the questions of why does God permit evil, or why does God permit suffering, and why doesn't God do something about it. Instead, the answer is that God has a purpose in our suffering, and that we need to trust him, that we need to have faith in him, and that as difficult as it may be, we need to rely on God's wisdom. And what's wisdom? Wisdom is more than just knowledge and facts. It's the ability of applying the truth to your life in the light of your experience. Wisdom includes knowing God. Wisdom is not just the theory of knowing what to do, but it's the practice of doing what needs to be done. I actually came across a reference to the Star Wars movie in reading about Job for this morning's message. Remember Yoda, that wise and ancient sage, who, by the way, I'm certain has Irish heritage and would know how to get to Dublin from anywhere? It's as though Yoda might say, wisdom is to apply or not apply. There is no try. And point 3, Job realises that he needed to find out what kind of Job God wanted for God's purposes. The kind of Job God wanted was for a Job who had unshakable trust in God no matter what was happening. And it's the same for us. What kind of me does God want for his purposes? The kind of me God wants is to have unshakable trust in God at all times, no matter what is happening. God knows the pain we go through, and he never leaves us there. We need to keep the faith and know that God will rescue us. We just need to trust him, even when it feels absolutely impossible to trust him. Thank you.